Well, the Trump for President campaign has a very bad day coming, the worst day any presidential campaign has ever had. And that day is scheduled for September 26th. The Harris for President campaign is now 46 days old, and every one of those days has been a bad day for Donald Trump. But the worst campaign day for Donald Trump is coming on Thursday, September 26th. Donald Trump is now formally scheduled to have the worst day in the history of presidential campaigning as we know it. He will be the first presidential candidate in history to have a federal prosecutor outline in detail, in writing, including possibly secret material from a grand jury describing Donald Trump's federal crimes that the prosecutor says Donald Trump committed to overthrow the will of the American people in the last presidential election. Federal Judge Tanya Chutkan ruled late today that on September 26th, Special Prosecutor Jack Smith must file his full evidentiary argument in writing about why Donald Trump can be charged with federal crimes, even though the Supreme Court created a new presidential immunity from criminal charges for some of what Donald Trump did to overthrow the election results. In a 1 hour, 14-minute hearing today in her Washington, D.C. courtroom, Federal Judge Tanya Chutkan dealt with a flurry of attempts by Trump criminal defense lawyers to delay any consideration of evidence in the case of United States of America versus Donald J. Trump until next year, no doubt in the hope that Donald Trump will then be in a position to order a new attorney general to drop the case. An appeal of the case to the United States Supreme Court earlier this year allowed Trump-appointed Supreme Court justices to create a brand new law of the land based on nothing in the Constitution, granting criminal immunity to Donald Trump for some of what he did leading up to and on January 6th. Special Prosecutor Jack Smith and his team, having now read the Supreme Court opinion, limiting what evidence they can present about crimes committed while Donald Trump was president, impaneled a new grand jury in Washington, D.C., which issued a new superseding indictment of Donald Trump, which preserved all 4 criminal charges against Donald Trump in the original indictment, including conspiracy against the United States of America, but eliminated some of the underlying evidence that supported those charges. Special Prosecutor Jack Smith obviously believes there is enough evidence in the superseding indictment, which is 9 pages shorter than the original indictment, to convict Donald Trump of the alleged crimes. In court today, Jack Smith's team, led by Thomas Windham, urged Judge Chutkan to first do what the Supreme Court has ordered her to do and evaluate the new indictment to see if it conforms to the limits imposed by the Supreme Court's immunity decision. Trump lawyers opposed that approach because that would force possibly public consideration of the evidence against Donald Trump before the election. Trump criminal defense lawyer John Lauro argued instead that Judge Chutkan should first rule on the defense's motion to completely dismiss the case based on the Supreme Court immunity decision. If Judge Chutkan ruled on that dismissal motion first, no matter how she ruled, that ruling could and would be appealed by the losing side, and it could be appealed all the way to the United States Supreme Court, adding possibly another year of delay to the case. That delay is not going to happen. Adam Klasfeld, who will join us in a moment, was in the courtroom today, and it showed us once again that a court transcript can never quite capture the full drama of what happens in the room. When Trump's criminal defense lawyer began his complaint about allowing any evidence in the case to possibly be revealed before the election, Adam Klasfeld, live tweeting the proceedings, reported this. Lauro warns about prosecutors being able to put into the public record at a very sensitive time in our nation's history, which we can't ignore. Chutkan let out a sigh and leaned back in her seat at that remark. Adam will describe that moment more fully for us, but here is how it appears in the transcript. Mr. Lauro, well, it's incredibly unfair in the sense that they're able to put in the public record at this time, very sensitive time in our nation's history, the judge, Mr. Lauro, which we can't ignore, that they're able to, basically load up on what they think this case is about without our ability to meet those factual assertions with the right to cross-examine. John Lauro will have the right to submit a written reply to the prosecutor's written description of the evidence against Donald Trump. That written reply is due October 17th. A minute later, when John Lauro once again referred to, quote, this sensitive time, Judge Chutkan had enough. Judge, wait, Mr. Lauro, yes, the judge, let's just discuss what the sensitive time is. I understand there is an election pending, and I've said before, and I say again, that the electoral process and the timing of the election and what needs to happen before or shouldn't happen before the election is not relevant here. This court is not concerned with the electoral schedule. Yes, there's an election coming, but the sensitive time that you're talking about, if you're talking about the timing of legal issues and the timing of evidentiary issues in relation to when the election is, that's nothing I'm going to consider. The Trump team tried to throw another distraction at the judge that did not work. John Lauro told the judge he wants to file a motion to dismiss the case on the basis that Jack Smith's appointment as special prosecutor is unconstitutional. Justice Clarence Thomas was the only Supreme Court justice, that's 1 out of 9, who noted in his written opinion on the immunity decision that he also believed Jack Smith's appointment is unconstitutional. The opinion of one Supreme Court justice that is not part of the ruling in the case is, of course, immaterial, but it was enough for Donald Trump's favorite federal judge, Aileen Mercedes Cannon, who Donald Trump appointed, to reach the decision that Jack Smith's appointment was unconstitutional and thereby dismiss the criminal case Jack Smith brought against Donald Trump in Florida for illegal possession of classified documents and violations of the Espionage Act. Jack Smith is appealing that decision to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. The Circuit Court of Appeals for Washington, D.C. has ruled repeatedly over the years that the appointment of special counsels is constitutional. That means that Judge Chutkan is bound by the rulings of the appeals court in her jurisdiction. But she has, in effect, no choice but to rule that Jack Smith's appointment is constitutional. And nothing that Clarence Thomas or Aileen Mercedes Cannon has written seems to impress her. Trump's criminal defense lawyer told the judge, Justice Thomas wrote a very persuasive concurrence that suggested that the special counsel does not have authority. And in addition, another judge, a very respected judge in the Southern District of Florida, wrote a decision dismissing the special counsel's case on appointments clause basis and also on appropriations. And it is a critical issue that now has to be decided by the court in light of Justice Thomas's interest in this issue and also in light of what the judge decided in the Southern District of Florida. It seemed Judge Chutkan could not quite believe what she was hearing. She repeated to Trump's lawyer what he was asking for, which made it sound all the more preposterous. The judge, you want to file this because there's dicta in a concurrence? There's binding D.C. Circuit precedent on this issue. You have dicta in a concurrence written by Justice Thomas, and you have an opinion filed by another district judge in another circuit, which, frankly, this court doesn't find particularly persuasive. So that's your basis for seeking to file that motion? Mr. Lauro, Your Honor, we couldn't file the motion because of the circuit court decision. The judge. So is your argument that another district judge in Florida, that opinion, plus dicta in a concurrence in the Supreme Court, those two things combined to warrant me going against binding D.C. Circuit precedent? Mr. Lauro, what I'm saying is that the court should consider this issue, and Justice Thomas, in effect, directed us to raise this issue and suggested that we do it immediately in light of his view in that concurrence. The judge, he directed you to do that? Mr. Lauro, well, I shouldn't say he absolutely said, do it. But when you read that opinion, it's absolutely clear that that's something that we have to do now to preserve this issue. The judge, well, I certainly don't read the opinion that way. There is no suspense. on how Judge Tanya Chutkan is going to rule on that motion, arguing that Jack Smith's appointment is unconstitutional when it does finally reach her consideration.
I think what Donald Trump is really trying to do is be pro-family. I think what I have said is that we want our country to be more pro-family. There are, though, policy positions behind my view that the country should become more pro-family. It's become way too expensive to raise a family in this country. You have a lot of young women today who say they'd like to have more children, but for some reason, health or financial, they're not able to. We want to try to solve that problem.
In the 7 weeks since J.D. Vance accepted the nomination for vice president on the Republican ticket, that has been his pitch. He is pro-family. He will make the Republican ticket more pro-family. And he has policy solutions to remove the economic barriers preventing America from becoming more pro-family. Last night at a Turning Point Action event in Arizona, MAGA pundit Charlie Kirk gave J.D. Vance a chance to put a little detail on those policies.
It's very hard for working families to get by. How will we lower the cost of daycare?
It's such an important question, Charlie. And I think one of the things that we can do is make it easier for family models to choose, or for families to choose whatever model they want, right? So one of the ways that you might be able to relieve a little bit of pressure on people who are paying so much for daycare is make it so that maybe like grandma or grandpa wants to help out a little bit more, or maybe there's an aunt or uncle that wants to help out a little bit more. If that happens, you relieve some of the pressure on all the resources that we're spending in daycare.
Grandma and grandpa, they're so much cheaper than childcare. Why didn't we think of that? There are a couple problems with this. First of all, not every new dad or new mom has a living parent. Secondly, many millennial and Gen Z parents are moving away from their home bases in large part because housing has gotten so expensive. A recent Pew Research Center study shows only 55% of Americans live within an hour's drive of their extended family. And the 55% of Americans who do live close to their parents might encounter a different problem. Their parents are often still working because either they want to or because they have to, which means that dropping everything to watch the grandkids actually comes at a cost. J.D. Vance himself knows something about this. Remember this old J.D. Vance interview, which resurfaced last month?
It makes him a much better human being to have exposure to his grandparents.
Well, I don't know.
And the evidence on this, by the way, is like super clear.
That's the whole purpose of the postmenopausal female.
Okay, set aside for 1 second J.D. Vance agreeing that the whole purpose of the postmenopausal female is to watch her grandkids, which is just, okay, J.D. Vance. That exchange was about Vance's mother-in-law taking a year-long sabbatical from her post as a molecular biology professor so that she could look after J.D. Vance's children. And this shouldn't even bear explaining, but not every working grandparent is a biology professor who can temporarily or permanently leave their job to watch the grandkids. Many of them aren't even able to retire until after age 75. But according to J.D. Vance, the federal fix for daycare costs is to phone grandma, the postmenopausal female. That's her purpose. As for his running mate, Donald Trump, he detailed his own, plan to lower child care costs earlier today.
If you win in November, can you commit to prioritizing legislation to make child care affordable? And if so, what specific piece of legislation will you advance?
Well, I would do that, and we're sitting down. I was we had Senator Marco Rubio, and my daughter Ivanka was so impactful on that issue. It's a very important issue. But I think when you talk about the kind of numbers that I'm talking about, because look, child care is child care. There's something, you have to have it. In this country, you have to have it. But when you talk about those numbers compared to the kind of numbers that I'm talking about by taxing foreign nations.
Child care is child care. You have to have it. The Trump-Vance plan for rising child care costs is make the grandparents watch your kids. Never mind the fact that a lot more Americans are working a lot longer. A 2022 survey found that over 40% of Americans between the ages of 55 and 64 did not even have a retirement account, which probably makes it somewhat challenging to drop everything and go babysit. Joining me now is Maya Wiley, President and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Maya, it galls me that the Republican Party proposes itself to be the party of the working class that understands the economy. And you have literally the vice presidential nominee out there proposing a solution that has nothing to do with the economic hardships faced by working people in this country.
They actually have nothing to do with understanding what most people in this country's lives are like.
Yes,
it's like when George Bush ran and didn't understand how cashiers worked at the grocery store, right? You're like, where do you live and who do you talk to? Because I'm sorry, it's both. They want to raise the retirement age for Social Security benefits, the thing that half of Americans have to rely on in order to retire and then maybe be a caretaking grandparent.
Yes.
Or what about if your mom gets Alzheimer's?
Right.
Or your dad has a stroke? Then what are you supposed to do? Not only that, what if you moved away from your family because you couldn't afford the housing? The two most expensive costs of living for parents is housing and child care. And, you know, I'm sorry, what about the woman who is working in a pre-K as a teacher earning $40,000 a year with her own young child, and she can't even afford the tuition for her own young child in the program she's teaching in, but you want to tell her that her problem is that she had to get an education.
Yeah.
So maybe you have cats. I don't know. I do.
I have two little ones, and I love my mom, but she's not going to be a full-time caregiver for them. I feel like this statement on the part of Vance is so important to unpack because it hits at everything you're talking about. It hits at the social safety net, which Republicans want to gut. I think it's something like there's a vast number of retirees that depend on Social Security benefits for 90% of their income, right? They want to slash those. They do not care about health care in any meaningful way. If your parent has a stroke and is a designated child care giver, what do you do then? There's the cost of housing that this is like obviously numb to. And then there's just a fundamental, like, you know, equity.
It's making up a fantasy about life in America.
Yeah.
A fantasy you wish was true and real. Because my biggest fantasy after starting my family was that my mom would be living at home with us, and we did a 3-generation household, and she got Alzheimer's.
Right.
Right? And look, I was one of the lucky ones because we had a 2-paycheck family and could pay for childcare. You know, in the de Blasio administration, when I was counsel to the mayor, you know, when we were doing the analysis on creating universal pre-K, we knew we were putting $5,000 a year back in the pockets of families. It was an income inequality strategy that also benefited the educational futures of children. That's called problem solving that understands what people's lives are
actually like.
What they want to do is create a fantasy and then force us to figure out how to eat, pay the rent, and get some good care for our kids without any help.
Well, with no federal solution to a structural problem in our economy. The other part of it that's so weird that keeps happening with J.D. Vance is his obsession with controlling women, right? It's the role of the postmenopausal female. It's the role, his recent jag about how women need to be having babies earlier, his obsession with when and how and if women have bear children, the concerns he has about declining fertility. I mean, all of this paints a very sort of odd, dare I say, weird portrait of a man who is at once obsessed with the control of women's bodies, but is completely out of touch in terms of the realities of them.
And has a working wife.
Yes.
As he denigrates women who choose to work.
And a working grandparent.
And a working grandparent who is a faculty member. It's like, what world do you want? Because really what it sounds like is you want it all. And that means women are stuck with nothing. But it's also what is exactly so alienating about it. Because take child care. 95% of people were either owning a child care facility or working in one is a woman.
Yeah.
And yet those child care facilities are making 1% profit. I mean, they're working poor. The women working in those facilities are the working poor.
Right.
They're working and they're poor. I mean, what does that tell us about this fantasy about women performing these jobs, and also the fantasy about work, and then the denigration of women who've actually figured out a way to make it work?
It's so
I mean,
true.
it's like, we're going to penalize you no matter what.
Yes.
And you and I know this because people who look like us have always worked and had to raise kids and had to raise other people's kids.
And our moms worked, too.
And our moms worked. And
Even when they were postmenopausal.
Right.
I got to ask, because before we got into the segment, we played some sound of Donald Trump offering an absolutely garbled, completely incoherent answer on how to lower the cost of childcare. At the end, he gets applause because it's, I don't know, they felt bad for him. Honestly, it's completely meandering and nonsensical. And I guess I wonder, like, does it not, like, does the absence of policy, does the absence of true connection with the struggles of working class Americans, does the utter incoherence and mendacity of this platform really just no longer matter to any of its adherents?
Clearly. Or they wouldn't be adherents. But I think this is the thing. I think there are a lot of people starting to say, wait, what, Project 2025, you want to end Head Start programs? So we're talking about child care. That blueprint, that plan that was created by Trump administration officials, as well as that base, actually has a plan that is very clearly making sure that regular folks, without regard to their politics, don't get what they need. But here's the other thing. It isn't working. And there are a lot of people starting to scratch their heads and go, what? And I think one of the things we have to address is the double standard in the media and the coverage. Because let's face it, that was incoherent. And why are we talking about his cognitive abilities to be president?
Well, listen, we try. We're trying, Maya. We try to talk about his cognitive abilities. He will be putting them on center stage on Tuesday night at the debate in Philadelphia.
In the wake of this incredibly embarrassing indictment that shows several online right-wing figure like that right-wing commentator you just heard, Tim Pool, that they were allegedly unwitting secret paid agents of the Russian government, attempting to sabotage our election and sow discord among the American populace. Many of those right-wing personalities have become very defensive. A couple of them called it a leaked indictment, which was funny, even though it's just a public court document. Poole did at least revise his response when that was pointed out to him. The point that many of them have been making, or the defenders have been making, to the extent they are presenting any defense at all, is to say, look, I didn't know where the money was from. I was paid to say what I would have said anyway. And honestly, I believe they're telling the truth on that. All the anti-immigrant rhetoric and the vile culture war bigotry is the kind of stuff they were saying before the Russians showed up to pay them for it. It's always the way this stuff works. The most effective tactic to manipulate public opinion through foreign influence or to change laws on behalf of the wealthy interests is not to find someone who is opposed to what you want to do and then give them cash and have them renounce publicly and tell them what to say. No, instead, it's to go out and find people that are already aligned with those interests, and then just subsidize the hell out of those folks by throwing money at them, by raising their profile so they can just keep doing what they were already doing. And ideally, they do it for a long time, and they're comfortable doing it. Comfortable, in this case, to the tune of $100,000 per video, which I gotta say is pretty cushy in the world of digital media. And if that whole scheme sounds kind of familiar, that is because it is basically the same arrangement set up for Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas by billionaire benefactors like Harlan Crow. According to all the reporting we have, Thomas has been given gifts, both disclosed and, more significantly, undisclosed, to the tune of $4 million over the past 20 years. At least that's how much we know about as of now, thanks to some real dogged reporting by outlets like ProPublica. You can see in this chart just how much he's been given. Can you see Thomas there? You see where he is on the chart? Oh, yeah, he's there on the left. He's the huge red bar, and that's in comparison to the other justices. And every time Thomas gets caught being gifted a yacht trip or an RV loan that was then forgiven, or tuition payment for family. His defenders essentially say the very same thing that those right-wing influencers and their defenders say. Look, Clarence Thomas didn't change his mind. He's just ruling the way he would have anyway. And like those influencers, that's pretty much true. Clarence Thomas is a right-wing dude. He's a deeply conservative guy and would, at least I think in most cases and most issues, though not all, probably rule in ways favorable to Harlan Crow and his billionaire ilk, regardless. But that's not the point, is it? Right? You do not have to change his views. You just need to incentivize him to stay on the court. Offer him some gifts to continue doing what he's doing already. And the problem with all this is that not only does he get a ridiculous amount of gifts for doing what he does, his ethical compromises are extended in every direction. That includes his wife, Ginny, who is this right-wing activist, professional right-wing activist, and involved in all sorts of causes, including stuff having to do with January 6th. And in the face of efforts by Democrats to crack down on this kind of insane ethical violation, right? To reform the court, to bind it by even the most basic set of ethics that say members of Congress or every single federal employee has to abide by. In the wake of those efforts, ProPublica just unearthed new revelations about a group working to help Justice Clarence Thomas fight efforts to rein in the court. They obtained audio of the president of a religious liberty group reading an email from Thomas's wife, Ginny, profusely thanking them for fighting for Clarence Thomas's right to essentially keep accepting amazing gifts without any ethics rules.
Well, let me say one thing that's an encouragement, I think, and will be an encouragement because the people on this call are our very top supporters. I got an email today from Jenny Thomas, Justice Thomas's wife. And so I want to read that to you. She said, "Great to meet through the meetings today. I cannot adequately express enough appreciation for you guys pulling into reacting to the Biden effort on the Supreme Court." And then this is in all caps. "You guys have filled the sails of many judges. Can I just tell you, and this is all caps, thank you so, so, so much." So it's neat that, you know, those of you on the call are a part of protecting the future of our court, and they really appreciate it.
Our court, notice he said our court, they really appreciate it, meaning the justices, meaning not just Ginny, because she's a spokesperson for her husband in that case. These billionaires and interest groups need Justice Thomas to stay where he is and are lavishing gifts on him to ensure he will remain on the court. And it's just not that different from the Russians paying online right-wing personalities huge sum of money to keep doing what they were doing. Because at the end of the day, Clarence Thomas is just the Tim Pool of the Supreme Court.
Last night, Donald Trump participated in a Fox pseudo town hall moderated by none other than Sean Hannity. As the Washington Post's Philip Bump points out, these town halls are really just Trump rallies with a Fox branding. They don't generate anything new or newsworthy. They're filled with misleading claims and lies and are home to some of the most sycophantic exchanges on television.
This is a very tough interview. Let me ask you a more personal question, because you paid a very big price for getting into the political arena. Never mind opportunity costs that you would have had. You've had a successful business. Correct me if I'm wrong. You're a better businessman than I am.
But if 6 bankruptcies, successful, Sean. Curiously, yesterday's whatever you call it demonstrated one of Trump's driving MOs. Projection, projection, projection. Here he is supposedly talking about Kamala Harris.
She doesn't want to do interviews. Can you imagine her doing an interview like this or like any of them? I mean...
Okay, Grandpa, that's rich. Coming from someone who will only talk to friendly Fox hosts and right-wing YouTubers. He had more projection, talking about, of all things, someone rambling.
This is a woman who is dangerous. I don't think too smart, but let's see. But she loses her train of thought a lot.
Oh, does she now? Do I even need to fact check that? I mean, he knows when he speaks, cameras are recording him, right? This is the same interview where he seemed to forget who he was running for president against. And how about concerns that attacks on J.D. Vance for being weird or sticking? Here he is talking about Tim Walz.
There's something weird with that guy. He's a weird guy. JD is not weird. He's a solid rock. I happen to be a very solid rock. We're not weird. We're other things, perhaps, but we're not weird.
I am rubbery. You are glue. I dance like this. My VP is weird. Yours is weird. It's elementary stuff from the oldest presidential nominee in U.S. history. Meanwhile, his campaign is not faring any better, with reporting today about an internal email warning them not to leak information to the media. An email that was quickly leaked to the media. Joining me now is Tara Setmeyer, co-founder and CEO of the Seneca Project and a former Republican communications director, and Juanita Tolliver, Democratic strategist, MSNBC political analyst, and author of the forthcoming book, A More Perfect Party, The Night Shirley Chisholm and Diane Carroll Reshaped Politics. I know about this book, Juanita, and I'm obsessed. I cannot wait to read it. I'm obsessed. But I am going to start with you first because, what was that? I mean, I don't understand it as a town hall. And does it not raise, again, the question of Donald Trump's cognitive impairment? Because at certain points, he seemed to think he's still running against Joe Biden.
100%. He's wishing he was still running against Joe Biden. And that's why I think it keeps coming up, Joy. The reality is, I think this was a dry run for the debate stage next Tuesday. How many lies can you tell within 90 minutes? How much support can you garner from playing on people's fears? And how does that play to his base exclusively? Those were the three things he was testing out. And I think it gave his psyche a boost to be able to tell those lies, of course, with no fact checking. I don't think anybody at that network will be capable of doing that or willing to do it. And so I think this literally is what we can expect to see next Tuesday. The lies were just so outrageous, though, Joy, when he was talking about immigration or the economy. In one lane, he went so far as to say that if Vice President Harris is elected president, then she'll lead to the Great Depression. And I'm like, this is the same vice president for the administration that literally rebuilt the economy that you ran into the ground during the pandemic. Okay, sir. So he seems to have no connection to reality right now, but he's using this to boost his ego and practice for the debate to see how many lies he can spew in record time.
I hope this isn't practice for the debate, Tara, because if this is how it's going to go, Lordy, Jesus, take the wheel. Let me play Donald Trump answering what should be a really easy question, because they are the forced birth party. Their new thing is to say, hey, we're also the daycare party. Somehow we're for childcare, not daycare, but childcare. We're for childcare. Here's Donald Trump trying to answer that question.
If you win in November, can you commit to prioritizing legislation to make childcare affordable? And if so, what specific piece of legislation will you advance?
Look, childcare is childcare. There's something, you have to have it. In this country, you have to have it. But when you talk about those numbers compared to the kind of numbers that I'm talking about by taxing foreign nations at levels that they're not used to, but they'll get used to it very quickly. Those numbers are so much bigger than any numbers that we're talking about. I want to stay with childcare, but those numbers are small relative to the kind of economic numbers that I'm talking about, including growth.
Tara, I don't know if anybody can see this. My producers printed out what he said. We played a little. We didn't even play the whole thing. This is how long the paragraph is, and I think it's maybe one sentence. Tara, what was that? What happened?
Well, that's a con artist trying to con. He doesn't know what he's talking about, and it's coming from a guy who didn't raise his own kids and has no idea what child care actually means or how it impacts everyday families. That he was trying to BS, which is what he always does when he doesn't know, because he doesn't know a lot of things. He's an ignoramus. So I think we're going to see a lot of this on display, because the debate on Tuesday, he's actually going to be cross-examined for the first time in front of the American people in a way that he never has before. And that's going to be by Kamala Harris. And this is just another example of Donald Trump trying to gaslight the American people into believing he'll say and do whatever to get elected. It's the same thing when it comes to women's reproductive freedom. It's the same thing with the Project 2025 agenda, extremist agenda against women and reproductive rights and IVF. The Seneca Project, we have a big ad coming out tomorrow about IVF and girl dads and what they want to do to families in this country. And Donald Trump can run around and try and confuse the American people about his stance. But we all know he's a lying liar who lies. He's lying about women will be great under my administration. Really? This is a guy who insults women, who is an adjudicated rapist. He's got a misogynist on his ticket in J.D. Vance, who has significant mommy issues, who seems to think these are the two people we want in charge of our country. One's got daddy issues, the other one's got mommy issues, and the rest of us are going to pay the price for it. And American women are starting to see right through it. That's why Kamala Harris has a gender gap that is really significant. And I think, and that's what we think at the Seneca Project, will make the difference in this election.
But you brought forth J.D. Vance. Let's hear him trying to answer the same question. How do you pay for child care? J.D. Vance, go, James David, go.
One of the ways that you might be able to relieve a little bit of pressure on people who are paying so much for daycare is make it so that maybe like grandma or grandpa wants to help out a little bit more, or maybe there's an aunt or uncle that wants to help out a little bit more. If that happens, you relieve some of the pressure on all the resources that we're spending in daycare.
Juanita, this is the guy. This is the guy who previously said on a podcast that his Indian mother-in-law, because she's a postmenopausal female, that's what postmenopausal women, the podcaster said that, and he agreed with it. And then the guy said that's why you have the benefits of having an Indian mother-in-law. So he's essentially saying the answer is indentured servitude for postmenopausal women. That's what it sounds like to me.
Donald Trump is painting a very dark picture of the economy. He is claiming that Biden and Harris are anti-energy, and he's blaming them for the stock market crashing. So let's get things straight for fact's sake. This administration is producing record amounts of oil, and VP Harris just pledged not to ban fracking. And look over at the stock market. The Dow is up nearly 18% over the last year. Vaughn, there was a lot of nonsense in this speech. Much of it, and I'm not speaking subjectively, it is fair to say much of it was incoherent. There weren't even complete sentences. What am I missing?
I think that's a really good point you make. I mean, for more than an hour, Stephanie, he outlined what was billed as an economic speech. Frankly, he was asked by one of the individuals by the Economic Club of New York about his child care policy. It was not coherent. There was no exact policy or details that were provided. He went back to suggesting that he would put imports or put tariffs on all imported goods. He called for the rescinding of carbon emission standards. He called for a rescinding of tax credits for electric vehicles. He went on to call for a corporate tax rate staying at 21%, extending the 2017 tax legislation that he and Republicans on Capitol Hill passed. But by and large, there was very little in the form of new actual economic policy introduced. Of course, you heard Donald Trump there suggest that he was going to put Elon Musk in charge of this commission that would audit the federal government, but there's no details, there's no actual substance or specifics on what that would even look like. And they say government waste, but this is a Republican Party that has been very unspecific about government waste. And it was the Trump administration that added more to the deficit than the Democratic administration. So I think oftentimes we're looking for answers, and frankly, we don't quite always get them.
And while cutting the corporate tax rate, people are like, well, if he cuts corporate taxes more, my goodness, it'll goose the stock market. And he has yet to explain ever how he would pay for it. Here's the thing, John. This speech was an absolute word salad, right? They served word salad for lunch at the New York Economic Club. But the thing that is most galling, that wasn't a low information room. Those are highly financially literate people. Right? It was just reported today, Howard Lutnick, the CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, is now the key Wall Street person speaking to Wall Street on Trump's transition team. Every single person in that room knew it was pure nonsense he was spouting, and some of them even applauded. What is going on here?
These are people who don't give a salad about whether Donald Trump is going to do X policy or Y policy as long as their taxes come down, right? It doesn't matter whether he's got a Veg-O-Matic where his mouth should be just spitting out vegetables all over the room. If he's going to cut taxes, and he says he's going to cut taxes, and he has, by the way, a record of cutting taxes for these guys, they're going to be happy. That's it. I mean, he comes up with this government efficiency commission. The idea here is to figure out where there are improper payments and fraud. He's going to audit the federal government. It's a brilliant idea. The founders came up with it. It's called Congress.
Listen,
that's what they do for a living.
Listen, it's not necessarily a bad idea, but because the government spends way too much money and it doesn't have the discipline and proper audit. But Elon Musk is going to be the guy doing it?
Well, I mean, look, Tesla is successful in large part because of the subsidies that it got from the federal government. So here's a guy who's like, this is kind of like the robber. I mean, I'm not saying he committed any crimes, but this is like the robber, guarding the bank, right? Like, he is somebody who has benefited from the government largesse as much as anybody in this country, turning on, by the way, his entire SpaceX built on the backs of our federal tax dollars in the space program that we used to have. So that's not an attack on Elon Musk, but simply like he is somebody who very much has taken advantage of the things that he says now
I
are so
wonder
bad.
if he'll audit those big government contracts that he has. Kayla, Kamala Harris has been messaging a very pro-business agenda to voters. She laid it out this week. What reporting do you have on her economic pitch?
Well, for one, Harris is talking about the economy a lot different than Biden. Really, Biden was focused on defending his record. He constantly touted the 15 million jobs that have been added to the economy since he took office. She's taking a very different approach. She is starting from the basis point that many Americans are feeling, which is the economic pain. And often Biden's messaging felt very detached from that. But really, we saw the first sign this week that she is going to have a more pro-business approach when it comes to policymaking. We saw that with her small business proposals, potentially increasing tax-deductible expenses from $5,000 to $50,000 for startups. And she is still increasing this capital gains tax from 20% to 28% on earnings of more than $1 million. But that is far less than what Biden had proposed in his budget proposal, which would be almost a 40% rate. So she's definitely taking a different approach than Biden and starting to show how she's differentiating herself from the incumbent.
So, John, where does the narrative come from that she's less pro-business than Joe Biden was, right? Her actual numbers in her policies are more pro-Biden are more pro-business than Biden. Then why is there this narrative that she's super progressive, she's borderline communist? The numbers don't bear any of that out.
I mean, the honest answer is the narrative comes from the campaign she ran in 2019 when she was trying to get as far to the left as she possibly could to win the Democratic primary. In the course of time since then, she joined a Biden administration that was much more moderate than she had campaigned. And she is now effectively continuing. I know there are some adjustments here and there, but she's effectively continuing what Biden has laid out there. So when you talk about the child tax credit expansion, Joe Biden also wanted to, and it did at one point, expand the child tax credit. When you talk about first-time home buyers, money for them, her number is a little bigger than Joe Biden's. He had 15,000, I think, proposed. Hers is 25,000. So you look through those policies, and it's basically like moving in the same direction. And to your point, at the very beginning of the show, you pointed out all these numbers that say the economy is actually in pretty good shape. The problem, it comes in telling people that the economy is in good shape when they know that prices are hurting their wallets. And they are. And whether you are buying, beans at the grocery store or a yacht, you feel inflation. Everybody in this country knows that things cost significantly more than they did 2, 3, 4 years ago. And, part of Kamala Harris's job over the course of the next couple of months is to explain to them things will get worse if Donald Trump is president, in her view, and better if she's president.
And that's sort of the point that, yes, inflation is a problem. But Donald Trump has not explained one single thing that would help this country with inflation. And in fact, you've got economists across the country who are saying his policies are inflationary. What? Tariffs, for example, make everything cost more. When we had those tariffs during the Trump administration, what did it do? It put farmers in a hole, and then we ended up with a huge farm aid program. Can we go back to Elon Musk, though? Because Elon Musk's response to Donald Trump possibly giving him this big post in his administration, he tweeted and he said he looks forward to serving America if the opportunity arises, but no pay needed. This isn't about salary. The power of the presidency is worth more than Musk could ever be paid. Let's be clear. It is not about a salary. But if Elon Musk is in a position to be a shadow president, to sit behind a wall and get whatever he wants from Donald Trump, that is worth far more than any salary. Is he actually fooling people with this idea that, no, I'm just here to help? I mean, come on.
I think there's two parts of it. Number one, that there is a legitimate story to be told about Elon Musk and his own move to the right. If you follow his own Twitter or X account, he is somebody that basks in conspiracy theories. And he is the one at the forefront of pushing the ideas that there are undocumented immigrants that are coming into the country at the hands of Democrats to vote. This is somebody who has found the popularity that Donald Trump found with the right wing and Tucker Carlson, and has embraced that moment at a point in time in which you see the amount of the workforce that he laid off at Twitter or X, and the way that they, again, I will use the word bask in the idea that somehow X is working more efficiently or is working just as at least effectively, when if anybody is on that program clearly knows that it is not. And yet when you look at what the Trump administration did 2 weeks before the 2020 election, when they did that executive order creating Schedule F that would allow the Trump administration, if there was going to be that second term, to go and reclassify the thousands of civil servant workers and turn them into political appointees, effectively firing career employees. It's not clear what their plans were. Was it 5,000 employees, 10,000 employees, 100,000 employees, million employees? That is an outstanding question. And if you are tapping Elon Musk, who has basked in the idea that he effectively was able to consolidate their workforce at his private company and would be able to do the same within the federal government, that is what folks should take seriously, because Donald Trump tried to do that at the end of his first administration with every intent to fire a potentially large segment of the federal workforce in his second administration.